Near a village called Kalynivka, in the Russian-held part of Ukraine's Kherson region, a Buk-M2 surface-to-air missile system sat on open ground on November the 30th, 2023. Its radar panel, barely larger than a household door, was the only part of the vehicle that could see anything at all. Ukraine's military announced the strike and called it a HIMARS rocket. Independent analysts who reviewed the same footage disagreed, arguing the blast pattern looked more like an AGM-88 HARM, an anti-radiation missile built to home in on a radar the instant it switches on. Two weapons have been named for the same dead radar, and nobody has publicly resolved which one did it. The 6 minutes in the title is not a documented figure. It is this channel's own framing, built around a real dispute this episode will not pretend to settle. That leaves a better question than which missile it was. Both candidates attack the same weakness from opposite ends, and both of them found this vehicle. So the question is why, either way, a system worth tens of millions of dollars ended up unable to see the thing that killed it. One more thing about that title, before the mechanism. No open-source reporting reviewed for this episode ties a documented 6-minute window to the Kalynivka strike, or to any specific Buk engagement anywhere in this war. The radar physics is real. The losses covered below are real. So is the unresolved dispute over which weapon killed this particular vehicle. 6 minutes is a dramatization, chosen to be physically plausible against how radar reacquisition actually works, rather than lifted from a report. The name Buk covers 4 generations of machine. The family is Soviet-designed. NATO reports it as Gadfly and Grizzly, and Russia markets the newest generation for export as Viking, a marketing name rather than a NATO one. It is a medium-range, mobile, radar-guided surface-to-air missile system, fielded from around 1980 onward, and upgraded in overlapping generations since. A Pantsir is a point defense gun, built to kill the one drone already diving on it. A Buk works at a different scale. It reaches out tens of kilometers to kill an aircraft, a cruise missile, or increasingly a drone, before any of those threats gets close to what it is protecting. Russia has fielded 4 broad generations: the original Buk-M1 from the early Soviet-era fielding, the improved Buk-M2, upgraded through the 1990s with a better missile, the 9M317, the Buk-M2, unveiled in the 2000s with a new radar architecture, and the newest, the Buk-M3, publicly unveiled around 2016, carrying a faster missile, the 9M317M, and a tighter reaction loop. Every generation shares the same basic shape: a transporter, erector launcher, and radar vehicle, called a telar, crewed by roughly 4 soldiers, that can find a target and fire on it without waiting for outside help, backed by a separate, longer-range acquisition radar that feeds the same picture to several telars at once. Publicly available specifications put the missile's own speed at somewhere around Mach 3. The limiting factor on a Buk has always been detection, seeing the target in time to launch at all. That self-sufficiency is the point of the system, and it is also its vulnerability, because a Buk battery has to keep at least one of its radars switched on to do its job. A fighter jet can go quiet and coast on someone else's picture. A Buk's own radar is close to its only sense. Turn it off, and the crew is driving a truck. Turn it on, and every receiver within line of sight, a drone's onboard sensor, a ground team's direction-finding gear, an aircraft carrying an anti-radiation missile, knows roughly where it is and can start closing the distance. The exchange is lopsided by physics. A transmitting radar can be heard from farther away than it can usefully see, because its outbound pulse only has to travel one way to reach a listener, while the faint echo the radar is waiting for has to make the trip twice. The same trade-off has a human version inside the vehicle. A Buk crew cannot simply leave the radar off to stay safe, because the entire reason the battery is posted forward is to catch exactly the kind of low, fast, hard-to-see contact that only shows up in the last stretch of the radar's own detection envelope. Switching off early to hide means switching off the one system that gives the crew any warning at all, and a crew with no warning learns about the drone when it arrives. Every Buk crew on a stretch of front like this one makes the same wager every time they power up: stay dark and be useless, or go active and be found. Kherson region forces that wager harder than most places. Since the autumn of 2022, the front line there has run along the Dnipro River, Ukrainian-held territory on the west bank, Russian-held territory on the east. Both sides fly drones across that river constantly, for reconnaissance, for artillery spotting, for strikes on logistics and troop positions. Russian air defense on the east bank exists specifically to stop that traffic, and a Buk battery, with its longer reach than a Pantsir or a shoulder-fired missile, is one of the systems assigned to do it. Move the same battery 20 kilometers, about 12 miles, back from the water, and it is safer and largely useless, out of range of the drone traffic it exists to stop. Keep it forward, and it is doing its job and advertising its own position at the same time. There is no third position on that bank, and crews have been choosing between the two since the river became the line. A Buk battery runs 2 radars in tandem. A separate, longer-range acquisition radar, NATO reporting name Snowdrift, scans continuously and hands contacts off to whichever TLAR is best placed to engage. Publicly available specifications put its detection range at roughly 85 kilometers, about 53 miles, against a standard aircraft-sized target, dropping to around 35 kilometers against something flying low, where the curve of the earth and ground clutter both work against it. It can track 6 targets across the battery at once. Each TLAR then carries its own shorter-range radar, a mechanically aimed dish that locks onto the handed-off contact and stays pointed at it long enough to guide a missile in. It works on the same principle as an old satellite dish turning to face a signal, except that this signal is moving, and the dish has to keep up with it. On the original variants, that engagement reaches up to an altitude ceiling, commonly sighted around 18 to 20 kilometers. The newer Buk-M2 and Buk-M3 TLARs carry a passive electronically scanned array instead of that mechanically aimed dish, a flat panel that steers its beam electronically rather than physically swinging the whole antenna around. The upgrade is substantial. An electronically steered beam can jump from one bearing to another in a fraction of the time a motor needs to swing a dish, which matters enormously when the target is a small, fast, low drone instead of a bomber. Defense literature commonly cites a track-to-launch reaction time in the low tens of seconds for the newer TLARs. No independent test of that exact number is publicly available, which makes it a rough benchmark rather than a documented measurement. The trade-off, regardless of generation, is that the panel is still fixed to the top of the vehicle, still has to face roughly toward whatever it is tracking, and still cannot see anything it cannot get a clean line of sight to. One more piece of the chain raises the stakes of losing that radar. A Buk missile does not fly itself to the target and think for itself the way a heat-seeking missile does. Older generation missiles use semi-active radar homing. The TLAR's own radar has to keep illuminating the target continuously, the way a flashlight has to stay pointed at something for its beam to keep bouncing off it, and the missile's seeker simply listens for that reflected energy and steers toward the strongest return. Cut the beam and the reflection stops with it, because the missile carries nothing of its own to look with. Finding the target and launching is only the start of the radar's work. It has to keep broadcasting, uninterrupted, for the missile's entire flight time, several seconds to tens of seconds depending on range, or the missile loses its only source of guidance mid-flight and goes ballistic, unguided, wherever momentum carries it. What is left in the air is a falling object with fins, still moving fast, no longer aimed at anything. That dependency varies by generation. The original 9M38 and the improved 9M317 missiles rely on continuous illumination for the whole engagement. The newer 9M317M, fielded with the Buk-M3, is reported to carry its own active radar seeker in the terminal phase, meaning it can find the last stretch of its own way to the target without the TLAR's radar staying locked on until impact. That shortens the window in which killing the radar also kills the missile in flight. The missile still needs the TLAR's radar to find the target and commit to a shot in the first place, so the broadcast that gives the battery's position away has only gotten shorter. Every method of defeating a Buk works through that line of sight requirement, and there are more of them than the word jamming suggests. Jamming, Broadcasting noise or false signals on the radar's own frequency is the one people picture first, drowning the real echo in manufactured static until the receiver cannot pick the target out. Terrain masking needs no electronics at all. A drone flying low along a riverbed, weaving behind tree lines or a ridge, simply never rises above the radar horizon long enough to be painted. Decoy saturation works on the same channel limit from a different direction. A Buk-M1 tracks 6 targets at once, and later variants somewhat more, but every variant has a ceiling, and a defended airspace with more contacts in it than the battery has channels to handle is a documented problem, not a theoretical one. Once every channel is occupied, the next contact through the door goes unengaged, whatever it turns out to be carrying. The fourth path skips the radar's electronics entirely. A first-person view drone, or FPV, or a loitering munition, flying itself onto the dish or the panel and detonating a warhead against it, commonly an RPG-derived shaped charge, or a fragmentation charge. And against a thin-skinned antenna, the fragmentation effect is usually what does the damage. That method produces no blind window at all. It destroys the antenna outright, and nothing in the field brings that back online. There is also a physics problem working against a Buk before any of those 4 methods gets applied. Radar cross-section, the effective size a target presents to a beam, scales with a target's shape and material, not just its physical dimensions, and a small plastic and carbon fiber drone can present a return roughly 1,000 times smaller than a fighter jet's. Flat metal surfaces and sharp corners throw energy back. Curved plastic and composite scatter and absorb it. A radar tuned and calibrated against Cold War-era bombers is working near the edge of its own detection envelope against a target that's small, well before anyone jams it or masks it. Part of why so many of the documented losses ahead did not need electronic warfare at all is that the target was already close to invisible on the manufacturer's own numbers. Publicly documented radar engineering, none of it specific to Buk, suggests a tracking radar that loses lock to jamming or masking can often reacquire within seconds to tens of seconds once the interference clears, because the antenna is still intact and the software still knows roughly where to look. That is a generic figure about how tracking radars behave, rather than a measured Buk result. And it is the honest reason a 6-minute blind window reads as dramatic rather than routine. For jamming or masking alone, 6 minutes is a very long time for a system built to reacquire fast. That is the difference between an interruption and a loss, and it means the length of a blind window says more about which weapon was used than the existence of one does. In the documented record, a window that long comes from physical destruction, or from damage severe enough that reacquisition stops being a software problem and becomes a maintenance problem. A radar with a hole in its antenna does not need a jammer to stay blind. There is nothing left transmitting. Bringing it back is not a matter of switching it on again either. It takes parts and a workshop, and until then the vehicle either leaves the position or sits in it, unable to do the one job it was posted forward to do. The radar has to broadcast to do its job, and that broadcast is a signature every side in this war has gotten cheap and fast at reading. Ukraine's own use of fiber-optic FPV drones elsewhere in this war, immune to jamming because they fly on a physical cable instead of a radio link, already shows the direction this is heading. Platforms that need no signal of their own to find and strike a system that has to keep broadcasting one. There is a passive layer to this too, distinct from any strike. A radar transmitting on a known frequency is a beacon to anyone with direction-finding equipment, and Ukraine has repeatedly used exactly that kind of radio triangulation, cross-referencing bearings from multiple listening points to locate Russian electronic warfare and radar positions well before a strike is ever launched. The strike is the last step. The finding happens earlier, off the frequency the crew is watching and on the one it is broadcasting. The traffic runs both ways as well. Russia has separately been documented modifying its own decoy drones to carry small warheads and target a Ukrainian Buk-M1, the same broadcasting problem in reverse, against the same family of system. None of that gives a Buk crew an easy way out. Powering down makes the battery blind rather than safe, and blind is a state a system whose entire job is early warning cannot survive in for long. This is the physics of active radar, applied to a war where finding the transmitter has gotten cheap enough that almost anyone can try. Back to Kalynivka. Ukraine's military put the strike on video. A vehicle burning on open ground near the settlement, identified as a Buk-M2, one of the systems assigned to watch the Dnipro crossings. The official Ukrainian account called it a HIMARS strike, a GMLRS-guided rocket. The independent open-source intelligence account known as Osinttechnical looked at the same footage and argued the blast signature read more like an AGM-88 HARM, an anti-radiation missile homing on the Buk's own transmission rather than being aimed at a fixed grid coordinate. Nobody has publicly clarified which it was, and both explanations are plausible. That gap is the state of the public record. The strike happened, and the vehicle burned. The tool that did it is still contested, and no official account on either side has closed the question since. Neither side disclosed crew casualties. Ukraine only has an AGM-88 to argue about because of a separate, publicly reported engineering effort. The missile was never built for a Ukrainian aircraft, and Ukraine's Air Force has spent part of this war integrating Western munitions like it onto Soviet-designed MiG-29s that were never wired for them. This is the point in the video for the subscribe reminder, before the numbers get bigger. A gap like the one in this single strike is close to the whole reason to follow coverage like this. It shows exactly where the argument sits instead of settling it for you. Subscribing keeps the next one of these in your feed. That single vehicle sits inside a much larger pattern. Oryx's visually confirmed loss list, built entirely from photographs and video that can be geolocated and checked, had documented, as of this episode's research, well over 130 Buk systems destroyed, damaged, or captured across the full war, the large majority older M1 and M12 variants, with a growing number of M2s and M3s added as newer generations have been pushed to the front. That is a floor, not a ceiling. Oryx only counts a loss with a geolocatable photograph or video behind it, so the real number is almost certainly higher than what the list can show, since plenty of vehicles burn in places no camera ever reaches. The clock that matters for this system runs on that list, and it only counts upward, one geolocated video at a time. A second Buk-M3 loss, photo-documented, surfaced in Kherson region itself in late August 2024, mechanism undisclosed in that release. In a separate claim dated October 2025, Ukraine's military intelligence, the GUR, said it had destroyed a Buk-M3 launcher alongside two Nebo SVU early warning radars, a mobile three-dimensional radar type used to feed the same kind of long-range picture a Buk battery relies on, in a combined operation spanning Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and Crimea. That claim has not been independently verified. Away from Kherson, the pattern gets simpler and less ambiguous. In Zaporizhzhia region, through 2024, Ukrainian FPV units have repeatedly published footage of first-person view drones striking Buk launchers and their radar sections directly. No jamming was claimed and no anti-radiation missile was involved, just a small quadcopter flown by an operator watching a video feed, closing the last few hundred meters onto the radar itself. Militarnyi has documented several of these strikes independently. Each one runs the simplest version of the mechanism: find the transmitting radar, fly a cheap weapon at it, take the antenna off the vehicle, and the battery stops seeing anything at all. In Kursk region, in the months following Ukraine's 2024 cross-border incursion, a Buk-M3 was destroyed in a HIMARS strike, publicly claimed by Ukrainian sources and not independently confirmed beyond that claim. On October the 21st, 2024, Ukraine's General Staff reported that its unmanned systems forces had destroyed a Buk-M3 roughly 60 kilometers, about 37 miles, behind the front line. Oryx has not confirmed it, and no independent geolocation was published. The pattern behind the claims stays consistent, even where the individual claims do not hold up. HIMARS, HARM, FPV drones, direction finding, 4 different tools, all capable of doing the same underlying job. A strategic layer sits above these individual strikes. Ukrinform reported in April 2026 on a sustained Ukrainian campaign, referred to in that coverage as Blind Empire, aimed at destroying Russian radar nodes, long-range and early warning systems like the Nebo-M, Podlet, and Kosta radar families, to open corridors in Russian airspace for deeper strikes. That is Ukrainian reporting on a Ukrainian campaign, not independent confirmation of one, and nothing in it names Kalynivka or connects to this particular strike. It matters here only as context. Ukrainian reporting describes the deliberate blinding of Russian radar coverage, one node at a time, quite openly, and a single Buk battery near a Kherson village is one small, disputed, but real data point inside that larger pattern. The cost math matters here too, hedged as it has to be. No manufacturer publishes an official price for a Buk-M2 Tilar, but open defense press estimates commonly place a single vehicle somewhere in the tens of millions of dollars, radar, launcher, and the missiles it carries included. Set that against a HARM missile at a commonly cited unit cost in the range of $280,000 for earlier variants, a GMLRS rocket at a commonly cited roughly $165,000, or an FPV drone whose component cost is commonly reported in the low hundreds of dollars to build and fly. Whichever weapon actually killed the vehicle at Kalynivka, the trade ran overwhelmingly in the attacker's favor. That asymmetry is why this class of system keeps appearing on loss lists across every sector of this war. Western sanctions on export-controlled electronics make replacing a damaged radar's guidance and processing hardware harder for Russia than replacing the vehicle around it, though neither government publishes figures on how much that has actually slowed production or repair. Both sides live with the same broadcasting problem too. Ukraine fields the same Soviet-era Buk-M1 systems Russia does, and has spent part of this war trying to close its own missile stock gap through the publicly reported FrankenSAM program, adapting existing Buk-M1 launcher hardware to fire Western-supplied Sea Sparrow missiles instead of the increasingly scarce Soviet-era ones, a separate effort from Ukraine's parallel work pairing its own S-300 radars into a Patriot-linked setup. 3 things to watch as this pattern continues. First, expect the disputes over mechanism, HIMARS or HARM, jamming or destruction, to keep happening, because neither side has an incentive to publish the exact tool that worked, and the gap between the accounts is unlikely to close on its own. Second, Buk crews on both sides of this war will keep shortening how long a radar stays switched on, shoot-and-scoot behavior borrowed from artillery doctrine and applied to air defense, because both of the mechanisms argued over at Kalynivka punish a radar that stays up. Third, FPV strikes on radar antennas specifically, rather than on launchers or missiles in transit, should keep growing as the cheapest and least disputable method on this list, because a drone video showing an antenna disintegrating leaves no room for an argument about which weapon did it. There is a lighthouse version of this problem. A lighthouse keeps its lamp lit and turning to warn ships away, and that same lamp tells anyone hostile exactly where the lighthouse is. No army owns that problem by itself. It comes with the idea of a radar-guided air defense system, and every crew running one, Russian or Ukrainian, works inside it. It is also why the dispute at the center of this episode will probably never fully close. Both weapons argued over at Kalynivka exploit the same underlying weakness from different directions. One aimed at a location the radar gave away by existing, the other aimed at the frequency the radar gave away by transmitting. A battery that dies to either one has failed the identical way. It stayed visible long enough for something cheaper than itself to notice. The identity of the weapon matters to the record. It does not change how the battery was lost. Understanding that does not require picking a side. In a war this saturated with cheap sensors and cheap strike platforms, the most expensive thing on the battlefield is very often the thing broadcasting its own location, on a schedule its operators do not fully control. The next system worth taking apart the same way is the one built specifically to survive that problem, and whether it actually does.